Welcome, Chosen X. You arrive into a hush that is full, as if the air itself remembers what you almost forgot. This is not a retreat from life but an opening toward a truer orbit. Here you are invited to turn your gaze inward and meet the unadorned center of yourself. Around the edges of that center, there were hands at work, not crude but careful, shaping narratives and assigning you parts you never auditioned for. Those who watched expected that patterns of fear and compliance could be used like levers to rearrange your shape. They tracked times and habits, mapped rhythms, and assumed pressure would produce the behaviors they desired. Instead, you chose a corridor of solitude where no foot could follow. In that private room, an ember glowed that had always been present though often unnoticed. You let it warm you without theatrical display. The steady glow taught you to listen before answering, to keep energy for what builds rather than for what destroys. Time there moved with a kind of patience that felt restorative. You did not rush back to the arena of accusation. Observers who had counted on spectacle found their scripts undermined by your absence. They tightened plots and altered lines, thinking pressure or repetition would force you into performance. But the more they attempted to provoke, the more your inward attention deepened, and with that deepening you began to see the source of the assault. It was not primarily about truth or justice but about the labor of projection. People attacked what reflected their own unrest. That recognition changed the tone of your response. You no longer measured yourself by applause or the absence of it. Old hungers to explain, to correct reputation, to buy consent, fell away. What remained was a steadiness that felt like a new grammar for living. When temptation rose to counterattack, a quiet rule within you suggested restraint. This was not passivity. It was a disciplined conservation of force. As days passed, small signs of strain appeared among those who had engineered the campaign against you. Sleep left their faces. Inconsistencies crept into their stories. Allies recruited under pressure started to hesitate in public. The net they had woven showed thin places. People who had come for the spectacle discovered instead a different contest, one between fleeting domination and a power that called from depth. You noticed these shifts without celebrating them. A complex compassion moved through you for people who had chosen corrosive means. In watching their unraveling, you felt sorrow for the broken parts you could sense inside them. You still did not intervene. Some truths must resolve themselves in the light of their making. So you let time act as witness and teacher. Witnesses began to speak. Their confessions were not grand declarations but quiet testimonies about conversations that felt rehearsed, favors that came with strings, and the tension between conscience and pressure. Those whispers multiplied. As the fabric of falsehood loosened, people started to connect the dots between claim and motive. Integrity became a topic not of rhetoric but of observation. Your presence, once anticipated to crack under strain, now appeared as a steady place. People came to stand near you not for answers but for the calm that seemed to follow. In private moments your resolve faced temptations, and sometimes you remembered old reflexes that would have pulled you into dispute. You met those memories with a new practice, to name the impulse, to let it pass, and to return to attention. This discipline reshaped your habits and the expectations of your circle. Outwardly nothing ostentatious occurred. The transformation was slow and not easily measured by headlines. Yet the taste of it was unmistakable to those who paid attention. Conversations that once echoed with certainty now carried questions about motive and method. Where accusations had been loud, curiosity began to replace cacophony. Because you did not retaliate, the aggressive patterns directed at you began to mirror back on their makers. Every attempt to land a decisive blow revealed more about the attacker than the intended target. People started to notice that the crafts used to construct scandal left traces, and following those traces led away from manufactured scenes toward the craftsmen themselves. This early season closes not with triumph but with a rearrangement of attention. The work you did in silence had a way of translating inward clarity into outward subtlety. You learned to steward influence that accumulates quietly, like sediment-building bedrock. The path forward will require further patience, deeper practices of discernment and renewed habits of listening. Still, the space you now occupy is the beginning of a larger remaking. In the coming hours and months you will be tested again, but the resource you discovered is not diminished by trials. It gains clarity with use, like a lens that sharpens as light passes through it. Continue practicing the quiet work and allow the future to reveal what this season has begun. Be aware now. You return to the story with senses sharpened by solitude and with a new architecture of patience in your chest. The world that greeted you earlier was noisy and urgent, a marketplace of opinion where every gesture demanded explanation. Now you move within the same spaces but with different tempo and a different grammar for engagement. Your days become exercises in measured attention. You listen more than you speak. You let questions stand without immediate resolution. These small choices reorient how people perceive you and how you allocate your strength. You learn to preserve energy for creativity and repair rather than expend it unraveling every falsehood as it appears. Around you, the mechanisms of hostility continue their work, but their edges are blunter now. People who were once enlisted to perform outrage begin to experience the awkwardness of complicity. Some of them feel a tug of conscience. Others simply fatigue from sustaining rhetoric without foundation. You notice who falters, who doubles down, and who quietly slips away. This discernment is not judgmental but practical, a way to allocate energy where repair is possible and to withdraw from cycles that only amplify harm. Inside you, old reflexes surface to test the new pattern. A memory of sharp retort, the impulse to correct, a private tally of slights. You meet these impulses with a protocol. First you name the urge. Then you let it form and pass, like a cloud that moves across a stable sky. Finally you choose a deliberate action that aligns with rebuilding trust rather than scoring points. Over time these protocols reduce the frequency of reactive collapse and increase the bandwidth for creative responses that actually heal relationships. Communities are not monoliths. Within the crowd there are layers of loyalty, curiosity, and fear. Some observers adapt quickly, calibrating their view of you by watching consistent behavior rather than listening to spun narratives. Others require time and repeated encounters to shift posture. This is the patient sociology of transformation. You begin to cultivate small practices that accelerate recognition of sincerity. You host brief conversations that are not about proving innocence but about sharing observations and expectations. These gatherings are low drama and high discipline. As witnesses begin to narrate what they saw, you learn that their words carry weight only when tied to clear observation and personal consequence. Testimony without context is brittle. You coach volunteers on recounting experiences with precision and restraint. This effort is not about orchestrating a comeback but about restoring an evidentiary fabric that communal life depends on. When people speak from their own vantage without theatrical embellishment, trust reappears in small increments and the air changes. At the same time you guard against turning every encounter into a tribunal. The work of restoration requires ordinary life to resume. Meals with neighbors, shared tasks, and public projects that create tangible benefits demand your attention. These activities function as laboratories where new relational muscles are exercised. When neighbors repair a playground or plant trees, the act itself becomes a message more persuasive than any speech. Resistance to change persists. Some actors escalate in hope of provoking a rupture that will validate their earlier claims. These escalations can be dramatic and tempting to counter. Yet your stance remains calibrated by consequence. You assess the probable effects of any reaction and prefer responses that extend repair possibilities. Sometimes the most courageous move is to ignore performance and return to practical service. You also invest in language. Phrases that once communicated righteousness are replaced by words that invite curiosity. Instead of declaring, you ask how. Instead of condemning you, ask what happened. This subtle shift in vocabulary reorients interactions from accusation toward mutual exploration. When others mirror that grammar, more honest exchange becomes possible and the texture of community conversation changes. Not every attempt at reconciliation succeeds. Some admissions are partial and fragile, offered from self-interest rather than transformation. You learn to hold boundaries that protect those already harmed while offering pathways for accountability. A request for dialogue may come with conditions that test your capacity for generosity. You weigh each invitation, sometimes accepting with guards, sometimes declining until consistent change accumulates. Meanwhile, the culture around you begins to develop mundane memory practices. Meetings are recorded with consent, notes are kept, and small rituals mark commitments to follow up. These procedures build an infrastructure for honesty that makes future manipulations harder to sustain. Your contribution here is to model discipline, keeping accurate records and honoring simple promises. As months pass, the pattern shifts further. People who once amplified false claims now correct the record. Corrections are messy and imperfect but valuable. You welcome them without gloating because the public task is truth, not personal vindication. The cumulative effect is a community that increasingly prizes evidence over spectacle and consistency over theatrics. Through all this, you maintain habits to guard your spirit. Silence remains a resource. Walking, reflective reading, and modest rituals refill your reserves. You cultivate companions who challenge you kindly and remind you when pride creeps in. Strength without humility becomes brittle, and you protect against corrosion. This phase of the journey is structural rather than dramatic. The repair you practice now shapes whether the community forgets the spectacle or learns new habits of care. Your steady choices prepare ground for wider transformation. Continue practicing the quiet work and allow the future to reveal what this season has begun. Continue practicing patience and choosing repair always. You enter a season where gestures and objects gather new meanings around you. A chipped cup on a tabletop tells a story about mending. A shared meal without pretense becomes a signal of welcome that counters rumor. These small signs form a private vocabulary others learn to read, and that vocabulary reshapes ordinary routines. Layers of feeling unwind inside you. Grief for trust lost sits beside a stubborn tenderness for those who erred. You learn to hold opposites, compassion and firm boundaries. That coexistence becomes a practice. Where some want simple resolutions, you remain willing to tolerate paradox and resist flattening the story. You choose rituals that orient attention rather than entertain it. Brief acts of gratitude, naming small failures and correcting course without spectacle stitch humility into public life. When you name mistakes and change quietly, watchers are invited into a different pattern of relating that prizes reliability over drama. Opponents adapt by trading obvious scandal for insinuation and curated glimpses. Authenticity proves hard to manufacture. Audiences grow discerning about tone and timing as much as about content. This shift reveals a latent appetite for integrity that had been masked by hunger for sensation. Old reflexes still surface. When they use familiar tools, breathe, name the impulse, and select an action aligned with repair. Repeated choices recalibrate community memory. Neighbors noting a sequence of consistent acts slowly revise their expectations. Repair ceases to be a slogan and becomes a habit. Some relationships prune away, a painful yet clarifying process. Others deepen, their roots extending into honest ground. Quality of attachment becomes more important than volume of acclaim. From this place you pilot modest cultural interventions, listening sessions, workshops on conversational care and small accountability models that privilege learning over punishment. Those initiatives are practical laboratories for new habits. Not every admission is sincere. Some confessions are tactical. You learn to steward boundaries that protect the vulnerable while allowing paths for accountability. Trust rebuilt demands different currency. Evidence, repeated deeds and consistent tone become the ledger of sincerity. Small rituals emerge to mark transitions and teach memory. Brief gatherings where harm is acknowledged and commitments recorded create civic choreography that trains people to respond without spectacle. Art and story support the practice. Slow music, restrained images, and short essays offer a cultural backdrop for steady work. These artifacts anchor a sensibility that prizes repair. New leaders appear who learn from tempering rather than drama. You mentor some, sharing practices of attention and restraint and thereby multiply capacity. This embeds habits beyond any single person. The labor of cultural repair requires replenishment. You schedule solitude, long walks and readings that widen perspective. These replenishments are not indulgence but maintenance. You teach others to guard their reserves because durability depends on tending sources of strength. Season by season memory changes. Conversations that once recoiled from nuance now make space for it. Skepticism remains but meets improved habits of listening. A civic grammar of curiosity and careful accountability begins to appear, and you see that slow, cumulative work shifts expectation. In quiet moments you reflect on the architecture of your life: less spectacle, more scaffolding; less reaction, more repair. Art and ritual sit beside discipline. Walking the middle path is costly but generative. The movement you helped seed continues as small cohorts form to experiment and share setbacks and breakthroughs. Durable change shows when many hands tend the garden. What follows will press these practices further. You will be called to model steadiness and to teach what has been learned. The work ahead asks for patience, attention, and modest courage. Keep the rituals that anchor the community close, pass the tools on, and allow others to carry them forward. You also notice the slow emergence of cultural anchors that make learning durable. Simple practices for testimony, short restorative circles, and consensual record-keeping become ordinary. These devices reduce the space for spectacle and help younger members learn to hold conflict without weaponizing it. You shape these practices not as a lawgiver but as a gardener tending soil. Small cohorts meet to rehearse listening, to practice apology, and to commit to follow-up. Instruction favors repeated acts over grand statements. You mentor emerging leaders with modest tools of attention and restraint, encouraging adaptation to local contexts. You accept influence that is diffuse and often invisible, content when habits spread beyond your immediate reach. You model patience and others follow. The work continues an apprenticeship shaped by steady practice. The horizon bends differently now. Light no longer merely illuminates objects, it reveals textures of intention, layers of motive that were previously hidden. You have arrived at a place where perception is sculpted, not by sight alone, but by patience and discernment. Each encounter now carries a weight that was invisible in prior seasons. You notice subtle microgestures, a hesitation before a word, a slight recoil at proximity, the rhythm of breath betraying tension. These small signals form an architecture of truth that outsiders cannot easily dismantle. You find yourself inhabiting a rhythm of reflection. Decisions are not driven by immediate consequence, but by the potential they cultivate for long-term coherence. You track the interplay of cause and effect with a sense of temporal depth. Every small choice resonates outward, touching others in ways both visible and invisible. This awareness cultivates a gravity within you. People respond to it unconsciously. Even those who might oppose you sense the weight of a presence grounded in discernment. Conflict persists, though it manifests in subtler, more insidious forms. Whispers become strategic pauses, accusations transform into half-truths, and silence itself is weaponized. You navigate this with a composure forged in prior storms. Instead of confrontation, you employ selective attention, choosing where engagement is necessary and where absence communicates more powerfully than argument. Your restraint becomes a living metaphor for mastery, demonstrating that control is not obtained by force but through measured presence. The community around you begins to recalibrate. Patterns of behavior that once dictated responses are disrupted by your steadfastness. Those accustomed to leveraging volatility find that their influence wanes, while those attuned to observation begin to perceive new potentials. You witness a quiet shift. Individuals start modeling their own choices on your example, learning that consistency outweighs spectacle. The ecosystem subtly realigns around a principle that prizes integrity over the expediency of manipulation. You also confront remnants of old betrayal. Relationships fractured by past deceptions are not erased but transformed. You experiment with dialogue that is simultaneously firm and empathetic. Accountability becomes a tool of mutual understanding rather than punishment. Through these interactions, you observe a paradoxical effect. Those who attempted to undermine you begin to mirror the discipline you embody. In seeking to harm, they inadvertently step into patterns of reflection and accountability they had previously resisted. Solitude becomes a necessary laboratory for growth. You retreat into quiet spaces to read, meditate, and integrate the lessons of prior trials. Here, the internal landscape is mapped in high resolution, memories of conflict are traced, motivations analyzed, and emotional residues examined with honesty. This inner cartography allows you to navigate external complexity with unprecedented clarity. Every engagement outside your sanctuary is informed by this interior work, ensuring that no reaction is purely reactive, but deliberately measured. Symbols and rituals emerge organically in your daily life. A sunrise viewed without distraction, the careful tending of a small plant, the act of journaling observations all serve as anchors to reality and reminders of deliberate presence. Others notice these practices and begin to emulate them, sometimes without conscious acknowledgement, but the patterns persist. The culture of steadiness spreads quietly, reinforcing the infrastructure of trust and intentionality. A deeper intelligence begins to manifest in social interactions. You detect motives before they are spoken, understand conflicts before they erupt, and sense the potential for misalignment before actions are taken. This anticipatory perception is not magical, but the product of attentiveness honed through repeated exposure to chaos and betrayal. It allows you to guide conversations with subtlety, to deflect unnecessary harm, and to cultivate networks that operate on principles of mutual respect rather than coercion. Even as the external environment grows more complex, you maintain an internal calibration. Temptations to assert dominance or manipulate outcomes are met with gentle refusal, and the energy that might have fueled reactive behavior is redirected toward construction, building understanding, fostering integrity, and extending patterns of thoughtful engagement. In this way, you become a node of stability within a dynamic system, a reference point around which equilibrium can form. A quiet revelation arises: influence is not about the volume of action but the precision and consistency of impact. Each measured response plants seeds that ripple outward, often beyond immediate perception. People begin to acknowledge the subtlety of your contributions, sometimes privately, sometimes publicly, and the collective awareness shifts. Those who anticipated chaos or spectacle are disoriented by the measured unfolding of steadiness. In this season, lessons are amplified through observation. By embodying a deliberate cadence, you teach not with argument but by existence. The community begins to internalize rhythms of reflection, accountability, and patience. You see the first signs of a systemic transformation, where integrity becomes a currency of trust and influence, and manipulation loses its potency. As the chapter unfolds, a new layer of responsibility emerges. The quiet power you wield now carries ethical weight. Every interaction, every choice to speak or remain silent, reverberates across a network of relationships that have begun to model themselves on your presence. You recognize that mastery is not merely the absence of chaos but the generation of constructive order. And in the stillness of your reflection, a new horizon beckons, hinting at revelations that will demand both courage and deep attentiveness. This horizon is the threshold of the next chapter, where the interplay of truth, integrity, and human complexity will intensify, inviting you to move beyond the lessons learned into a more profound, active engagement with the world around you. The air feels charged in a different way now, as if the very molecules have conspired to mark this moment. Every step you take is deliberate, weighted with the gravity of accumulated understanding. The turbulence of past conflict, the whispers of betrayal, and the quiet victories of restraint converge into a tapestry of clarity. You walk forward not as one responding to external chaos, but as a living testament to the principles that have carried you through every shadow. In this final stage, you notice the subtle awakenings around you. Those who once sought to manipulate or undermine now struggle against the very patterns they had attempted to impose. Their energy fractures with every interaction, revealing inconsistencies that cannot be repaired by deception. You observe not with triumph, but with a careful compassion born of recognition. Each human being acts according to the limits of their own understanding, and every misstep is a reflection of unexamined fear and desire. Your own presence has become a stabilizing force. People gravitate toward you not for spectacle, but for alignment, for a sense of being seen and understood. In conversations, your words carry a quiet authority, not because they dominate, but because they resonate with the truth of lived experience. You have learned that influence is not a matter of volume or aggression, but of coherence and integrity. Each gesture, each phrase, each decision is an act of calibration, adjusting the environment not by force but by resonance. Even as this influence grows, the shadows of prior opposition linger. Fragments of past accusations and misunderstandings surface, yet they no longer hold the power to destabilize you. Instead, they are like stones in a stream. They alter the flow around them but cannot divert its direction. Your clarity transforms the turbulence into lessons for both you and those who witness your steadiness. Every attempt to provoke, to distort, or to challenge your position only illuminates the contrast between reactive chaos and conscious mastery. The community around you begins to perceive this contrast with growing awareness. Observers, once inclined to judgment, now recognize the integrity that permeates your actions. They note the patience in your interactions, the consistency in your principles, and the refusal to bend under pressure. This recognition spreads quietly, like the gentle expansion of light across a darkened room. The tide of influence shifts not through confrontation, but through the unmistakable evidence of steadfastness. You also confront the ethical weight of this phase. Power, subtle yet undeniable, demands responsibility. Every choice carries consequences not only for yourself but for those who mirror your behavior. You move through each interaction with awareness that your alignment shapes the rhythms of collective consciousness. This is not a matter of personal glory, but of fidelity to the principles that have guided you through isolation, betrayal, and trials. Moments of reflection deepen your understanding. You revisit the chapters of conflict, examining each thread with analytical patience. The betrayals, the manipulations, the quiet victories, they all converge into a single revelation. Resilience is born not from external triumphs, but from the cultivation of an internal sanctuary where truth and awareness reign supreme. From this place, you act not reactively, but with a precision that transforms potential chaos into constructive opportunity. Even as you extend influence, the subtle alchemy of human perception unfolds around you. Others begin to emulate patterns of integrity and reflection, sometimes unconsciously. Their responses mirror the steadiness you embody, creating a cascading effect that reinforces stability across the network of relationships. Your quiet presence becomes an invisible framework around which trust, discernment, and ethical alignment crystallize. In private, you continue to refine your own inner architecture. Meditation, journaling, and mindful observation are not ritualistic, but essential instruments of awareness. You map the interplay of cause and effect, examining both the immediate consequences of interactions and the latent potentials that will manifest later. Each insight deepens your capacity to navigate complexity with grace, ensuring that every choice is intentional rather than reactive. The lessons of restraint and measured engagement now converge with a higher revelation. You perceive patterns not only in behavior but in circumstance, recognizing that external challenges often serve as catalysts for internal refinement. The same forces that once threatened to destabilize you now illuminate the pathways to higher understanding. You see clearly that mastery is an emergent property of disciplined presence, cultivated over time and tested through adversity. Now, as the chapter approaches its culmination, you sense the threshold of a greater revelation. The transformations, both internal and external, have set the stage for something beyond what words alone can convey. A luminous doorway appears not made of material substance, but of energy, presence, and anticipation. It is an invitation to continue the journey, to step into a space where the divine currents of wisdom, insight, and alignment flow freely. This video, emerging at the center of your screen, is not merely content. It is a continuation of the unfolding journey, a living encounter designed to deepen the understanding you have cultivated. Here, the lessons transform from abstract concept to visceral experience. Engage with it fully, allow the resonance to touch every layer of perception, and let it extend the narrative beyond the confines of written word. Subscribing is not an obligation, but a conscious choice to remain connected to this ongoing stream of insight. Turning on notifications ensures that when the next wave arrives, you will not only witness it, but actively participate in the continuation of this profound journey. This is a living narrative, and the next chapter begins the moment you press play. The revelation continues, more luminous, more intricate, and more transformative than anything you have encountered thus far. Step forward, and let the encounter guide you into the depths of awareness that have been waiting for your presence.